Hello, everybody. This is Karen Ramsey, and I am super, super excited about my talk today, a live event for the Raw Vegan Bundle. And I'm going to be talking with Chris Kendall. And we're going to be talking about one of the myths that goes on. And I'm really interested in the protein myth. That's always one of the first questions that I get about protein. So I'm going to ask Chris Kendall because he's written a whole book on all of these different myths that come up in the health movement. So let's see. There's Chris. The Raw Advantage. Bring Chris on. And I've got lots of questions. I think you're going to learn a lot by staying on with us today about the protein. Hey, Chris.
Hey Karen, how you doing?
Great to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. How you doing today?
Doing great. Doing great. Love our talks, and
Me too.
also really was very interested in all of the myths that you brought up in this new book that you have in the Ultimate Raw Vegan Bundle.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a fun one.
Yes. And I had already watched your video on debunking the whole mucoid plaque issue that has been talked
Okay.
about over and over again for years. And wow, that was really a good video. And I'm in
Oh,
total agreement with it.
thank you.
So,
Thank you. Yeah,
yeah,
some of them just never seem to leave, some myths they die hard and there's always new people promoting them and but it's good to try to debunk and demystify so that hopefully enough people see it that it slowly fizzles out over time.
yeah. And, and that's the thing. I do think it's really good for people to have this information
Yeah.
because it's not out there so readily. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. And the one that we're going to talk about today, I am specifically interested in
Yeah.
because I have friends and family members who, are eating meat
Yeah.
3 times a day
Yeah.
or animal food 3 times a day, especially if they're building muscle. I have one relative who is a big bodybuilder and looks great, but
Yeah.
he's eating like even meat for breakfast.
Uh, blah.
And so I'm very interested in this topic, and I've written down some questions for
Okay,
you.
perfect. Excited for it. I love questions, and this has got to be the biggest question that everyone has when they approach veganism or a raw food diet, or it's the biggest criticism they have. It's so marketed. It's just a huge topic, so I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, great. I love it. So, I've been a raw vegan now for 31 years,
Yeah,
and I've done a lot of research on the protein issue
of course.
because it's like a main topic. It always comes up,
Yeah.
and so many people are confused.
Hmm.
Um, Now, one thing is that yes, we need to get enough calories.
Yeah.
And I've always read if we're getting enough calories, we can pretty much be assured that we're getting enough protein. And actually, I think most people are getting way too much protein. And that's problematic that they're getting way
Yeah.
too much protein.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, in the past, like there was a book that came out back in like the 80s, I think it was, by Francis Moore Lapay on that we have to combine
Oh yeah.
protein in order to
Yeah.
get all the essential amino acids.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, like, is that true? She later on apologized and said, "No, sorry, that
Yeah.
book, you don't have to do that." Could
Yeah.
you talk
Well,
a bit about that and how that applies also to raw vegan?
absolutely. And also, I just wanted to briefly say too, like the idea that as long as you get enough calories, you're going to get enough protein. While accurate if we're talking about a balanced raw food diet that includes fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. If we're eating processed foods, or if we're eating, foods that are completely processed down, like say white sugar or oil, and that's a major part of our diet, well, yeah, we can possibly be getting not enough, right? But if we're eating whole foods, they include a variety of fruits and vegetables and greens and some nuts and seeds, as we'll go further into, then that makes it predictably easy. And there can be some tweaks potentially for certain people, certain situations, but it's harder to not get enough than to get enough in most cases when we're talking about a whole food, raw food based diet. And specifically when we're talking about combinations and stuff, I remember actually some of the first books I read, I don't remember if it was that one, I was reading like macrobiotics and different stuff like that. And they always recommended, mixing beans with rice because, it wasn't a complete protein and this and that. And I mean, the author of the book you mentioned is spot on. It's just not accurate information, very simply because all whole foods contain all 20 essential amino acids, right? And that has been something that, I mean, I didn't hear that. I had still continually heard that, some are missing in plant foods, like, and if you still need to mix them, to just get like all of them. And while there is truth that, over the day, week, month, you want to get a varied diet because different foods have different amounts of different types of amino acids. There's absolutely no need to be combining foods at one meal, nor to be combining like a protein food with a starch food at one meal. Invariably, that's going to lead to less efficient digestion, and it's just a straight up fallacy. It's just a straight up fallacy. We can definitely get enough for, any meal from just a serving of fruit. And in fact, I mean, we have an amino acid bank. We're always recycling amino acids. We're catabolizing tissues and reutilizing amino acids that can be reutilized. So technically speaking, you could be eating a protein deficient diet for a number. I won't give a number to it, but for more than a few days, more than a few weeks, without actually running into deficiencies of any single amino acid. But again, over the day, week, month, and year, it's important to get a variety of whole foods, but they don't need to be combined. We don't have to be thinking per meal, I must make sure I get every single nutrient, every single amino acid in the proper exact amounts at one meal because my body is going to fall apart. But people think that. They think like if they miss one meat meal or if they
Yeah,
don't combine properly, that they're not going to get enough protein,
yeah.
very simply because it's just got so much marketing hype around it and that kind of stigma of it being like
It's really sad
calories.
that this is out there because it's harming people. And
Oh
I
yeah,
see people like this. I see
yeah,
people, even in my own family, who are like bulking up on all the animal food to the point where I mean, it's scary to me because it's all that saturated fat and cholesterol. It just
yeah,
leads to problems down the road and chronic illness. So, trying to have
absolutely.
that whole protein fear is
Mhm,
crazy. I do understand that as we're getting older,
mhm,
that maybe we need a bit more.
mhm,
But even then, it's
mhm.
not like you don't have to add that much. Like,
No,
even when I was reading your book about the protein, I saw that you had written about like doing a little sprouting of like
yeah,
things like lentils, mung beans, things like that, chickpeas, to get a little bit more
yeah,
protein. And I have felt,
mhm,
as a raw vegan for 31 years and getting older, that
mhm.
yes, I do feel really good adding a little bit of that.
Yeah.
But
And
I
there's always ways.
don't add that much. Like I
No,
might make a chickpea hummus once a week
yeah.
or do a little sprouting of mung beans. And I really like the way I feel from
Mhm,
that protein and I feel like it digests just fine.
mhm.
And
No, absolutely. And a missing part of that I think some people don't really think about is most studies are done on the general population, and most people in general have weaker and weaker digestion as they get older from the onslaught of eating everyday normal non-foods, and one of the things that does usually get weaker is hydrochloric acid, which is required to break down proteins. And so I personally believe that part of that equation with the idea of needing more does to some degree come into that reality that most people just have less efficient protein digestion, and most people are eating proteins rather than free amino acids. And I think that's a really important part to nail down just because we actually have zero need for protein, like zero, like absolutely none. But we do have the need for the essential amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. And that's kind of the difference between animal-based, I won't even call them foods, just eating animals and eating plants. Is with the animals, it's preformed protein because they're eating the plants and then they're converting them into proteins in their body. And when we eat those, we need to break them down, which has a certain level of efficiency, and has of course, the different byproducts and negatives associated with it, just like we talked about. Whereas with the plant foods, we're talking about free amino acids, that don't require that same breakdown, so it's easier on the body, especially when we're talking about fruits and greens. And some studies they talk about cooked food being easier or stuff like that for breaking down protein. But then you got to look at what foods are they studying? Like are they looking at like hard old kale, or are they looking at the protein found in fruits and tender greens, which is a lot easier to break down, especially in fruits. Those are going to be some of the most easily assimilated amino acids in the entire plant kingdom. And a little piece of that too is, our needs are based upon what we actually absorb. And if we're eating, a high animal cooked food diet, of fried foods and stuff like that, we're getting less than is actually in the numbers for how much protein is in there. Whereas when we're eating fresh, raw fruits and vegetables, we have a higher absorption, easier absorption, especially on the fruits and tender greens, so that can actually make a little bit of a unseen, unsung difference in terms of total amounts versus how much you actually get in. So you may be eating this much on that diet, but absorbing that much, and you might be eating this much and getting that much, right? So it ends up being similar, but much easier for the body to handle without those negatives around it.
That makes so much sense. And then when you also think about the protein that comes in leafy greens, you're
Yeah,
talking about fruit and leafy greens being
yeah,
easier to digest, something like romaine lettuce or some of those
yeah.
adult lettuces that are easier to break down and absorb. We get, some really good protein sources here.
Huge, and they're so protein rich. I mean, greens can be like 25 to near 50% protein per calorie. And when we're talking about bok choy or broccoli or those are some of my personal favorites. They're really really good. And when you were talking about, bumping up protein a little bit, because hey, you know what? While I don't really believe that we have a huge need to, there's always the opportunity to. And, I recommend people run the experiment, and it can be a little bit different for age or for men versus women in certain cycles of life. There can be some difference. Um, and with that, it is really easy to bump that up. And
Yeah.
generally speaking, the most problematic amino acids, or the ones that some people could get low on and see an advantage in terms of their stamina and ability to have amino acid synthesis and create muscle tissues, is the leucine and lysine. And on a short term, I've never seen really issue with it, but I have seen people, just like you kind of mentioned, like yourself, like having some sprouts and stuff like that. Chickpeas and lentil sprouts are really rich, especially complementary in both of those amino acids, and it's super easy to bolster
Yeah.
that up. But
Yeah.
if
Also,
someone doesn't
so I
really
think
like them,
flour greens as well, which have a good amount of additional protein.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And if somebody isn't drawn to those foods, you can still get that extra protein kick, and especially with those two amino acids, with things like hemp seeds, they're actually quite rich in there. Broccoli, what are some other really good mushrooms even, green peas, chia seeds, pumpkin seeds, so I mean, for me, all of those are a fairly regular part of my diet and lifestyle. And
Too.
some of them jump in and out a little bit. At times I had a 10-year stretch where I had like zero sprouts, like I was just not into sprouts. And but I was consuming some of those other things. And I mean, I've had my blood values checked for protein numerous times, and they've always been top notch, and my recovery's always been really good. So that's at least
Yeah,
one little
really good
extra
to
bit of.
know because you're also an example of someone who's very active,
Yeah.
uh, and you're an athlete, and this can really speak to people who are trying to build muscle and who have been marketed to so strongly by the animal based industries that
Yes.
they need animal food when they really don't. And
Yeah.
seeing somebody like you who's eating meals until you feel satisfied. I
Yeah.
do know that you eat quite a bit.
Yeah. I like to eat.
Yeah.
I like to eat.
And, even though I'm thin, I love to eat
Yeah.
too. And people are often surprised at like how much volume I can eat.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that you should eat until you're satisfied.
Yeah.
Um, but the protein just doesn't come into play, and nobody ever died of a protein deficiency. So, these are all things that we have to look at when we're being marketed to. Like we
Absolutely.
have to look at what is misinformation, and that's what we're talking about here. I also wanted to ask you about, you talked in your book about fruit and fruitarianism. And I mean, there are some people who really do lean more towards just fruit and
Yeah.
don't eat that much greens.
Yeah.
And like, would they be at risk? Even though fruit, I mean, even a banana
Yeah.
is 5% complete protein.
Yeah.
Um, Mango
Yeah.
has all the essential amino acids. So is there a problem?
You know, I wouldn't say problem, but it depends upon your specific goals. Like myself, I personally really don't promote a fruitarian diet. While I think
I
that
don't.
if it's well, yeah, if it's well planned and you live in the tropics and you're in a very calm, balanced state and you're eating the top quality tropical fruit as your mainstay, including fruit veggies, like tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and okra and all those things, then you can do it absolutely, and it can be a healthy choice if you really do it well and get enough. But I don't see any advantage to it, and I see it being walking a tightrope where you have much more chance that you are going to be getting low or some insufficiencies in some alkaline minerals
I had
or even in
problems.
protein.
I had
Yeah,
problems
yeah,
years ago. Maybe I was into raw for about 10 years at that time.
yeah,
I just pretty much went to fruit. Now, I don't live in a tropical environment.
yeah,
And so my fruit was being shipped to me. We don't get enough minerals
yeah,
in fruit that's being shipped. If you live in a tropical environment and you're eating a lot of local fruit, then, maybe you have the opportunity to have
yeah,
that. But I was having symptoms like
yeah,
I had severe sores all the time on the sides of my mouth.
yeah,
And once
yeah,
I started eating the greens, even just like green lettuces,
yeah,
it went away a couple
yeah,
of weeks, never came back. So there were some definite mineral deficiencies going on. So yeah, I
yeah,
mean, I'm not in favor of
no,
it either, even though I do know that in terms of
mhm,
protein, that fruit also has protein. And if you eat
for
enough of
sure.
it, probably
Yeah,
can get protein needs
yeah.
met.
If you eat enough of it, I mean, it ranges roughly from between 4 to 8%. And I mean, our true needs aren't above that. We can look at mother's milk, which is, roughly around 5. And that's at our fastest growing rate of our period of our life. That's when we're growing the absolute fastest ever. And there aren't really many whole foods at all that are below that. Like, I mean, dates are the only one that I know of off the top of my head that are 4% compared to, 5 to 7 for most other fruits. And some can be higher, like durian. But if we're eating enough, we're going to be right within that range. But what I find is if people are just eating fruit, they may not be eating till total satisfaction because they're not really meeting all of those nutrient driven desires. You can basically meet your desire for fruit and be like, oh, I'm good. But when most of us have that experience if you're on the raw food lifestyle that you eat fruit until you're like, I'm really satisfied. Like I couldn't have a bite more. But then you have like a nice big crunchy salad or something like that. And all of a sudden your appetite's right back because it offers that other range of nutrients and flavors and textures and all that good stuff. So, what I've fairly often seen when people are kind of on more of that fruit, and no greens, or greens are going to slow my detox kind of kick, that they generally are subtly under eating. And I mean, it may not only be because of the nutrient kind of craving content, uh, but also oftentimes people that are kind of more drawn to the fruitarian kind of aspect may be more drawn to concepts such as breatharianism, or the idea that eating less is a better idea and we really shouldn't overeat fruit. It's like just have just enough, and it lends to, of course, getting thinner and thinner and less muscled, where it's not necessarily the fruit, but it's kind of living from a philosophical viewpoint rather than from a rational science and experience backed viewpoint, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, while we can definitely, it's possible to get enough, my interest here is in thriving, not surviving. Like you can survive on a fruit only diet and you can do pretty well if you really know what you're doing, but there's no advantages. And to me, it's just disadvantages. And again, it's kind of living from philosophy rather than something that's really grounded in physiology, anatomy, and no nutritional
I
science and experience.
totally agree. And because I didn't have this information when I began,
Mm,
I also was one of those people who just thought, oh, I should not eat so much.
mm,
And I lost quite a bit of weight
yeah,
very quickly.
yeah, yeah, me
I
too.
am normally 114, 115 pounds.
Yeah.
And I went down to like 85 pounds very quickly.
Karen, geez, Louise. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's them.
it was
Yeah.
really bad. And I remember I spoke with Dr. Doug Graham. I hosted him when he was in New Jersey one time, and I had lost all that weight.
Mhm.
This was back in the 90s. And he said, you gotta eat more. You gotta
Yeah,
like
yeah,
probably triple what you're eating. And I
yeah.
was like, oh, but I was reading that, that we shouldn't eat so much. And he was like, no, that's not this way of eating.
No,
With this way,
exactly.
you got to eat more, not less. Got to
And
eat until you're fully satisfied. So once I
yeah,
started doing that, I quickly put on the weight. I got up back to my ideal weight,
mhm.
and and I realized this is not about under eating. We don't want to under eat.
No, no,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, that kind of advice is more fitting for other diets that are, way too high in fat or that are rich in processed foods and really high calorie foods per volume. But when we're talking about fruits and vegetables, it really is a diet of abundance that's a little harder to overdo than to underdo. So in my mind, for the absolute and utmost, it's better for most people to err on a bite or two more rather than a bite or two less. And again, especially when we're talking about fresh fruits and vegetables, leafy greens, those kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you. That is such great information. I just want to go back to what you were saying about mother's milk, because
Yes, yes,
that really sits really well with me.
yeah,
In terms of, mother's milk, 5 to 7% protein, and people are, thinking we need animal food. Cow
yeah,
milk, even goat milk, is about a 20%
yeah,
protein. If we look at what babies need, I mean, at the time that they're growing the fastest in their life, it's
yeah,
5 to 7% from human mother's
yeah,
milk. So what are we doing with 20%
yeah.
protein? And this
Yeah. It,
just also really made so much sense to me.
yeah, it really doesn't make much sense to be consuming the milk from another species that is designed to take a little teeny itty bitty calf and grow it into like a multiple 100-pound animal in a short order, because we're not only getting that higher protein, but we're getting the hormones and some of the pus and all that good stuff, right? But it is really nonsensical, and people don't recognize too, like amino acids, they're acid forming, and if we're eating too much amino acids, well, that creates more acids in the system, and that's part of the reason why milk is actually acid forming, even though it has so much calcium in it, is because of the high protein and those amino acids in there as well.
And that high protein is difficult on the liver and the
Yeah,
kidneys. And that's
yeah.
why 70% or around something like that of the calcium gets washed out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a higher rates of drinking milk are correlated with higher rates of osteoporosis. So it is a catch-22 with all these commercials like where did you get your calcium, like in the milk mustaches and stuff. it's all marketing. They found the cash cow. That's the sad thing. They found the cash cow and they're milking it
Yeah.
for everything they can,
Yeah.
at the detriment of them and the individuals, of the cows and the individuals consuming it. So I recognize that in
Children
times.
growing
Mhm.
up on dairy and having so many health issues. I mean, so
Yeah,
many children with
asthma
severe
and
allergies,
yeah,
asthma, eczema, all these
yeah,
things.
yeah. Well, a huge percentage of the population is lactose intolerant, which makes sense because after weaning, we become lactose intolerant. So there's no need to be consuming the lactose, uh, the the milk formed proteins, right? So it's it's it, it's really a sad reality, but it is powerful marketing that has been driven into people for so long because again, it's a way for industries to make money and it's been shown if you just put protein on the package, it's going to result in way more sales. So, if you say it like this, protein, well then, they'll make even more sales, right? So they just ramp those up. And I mean, people look at muscle magazines and think that that's not driven by profit. It's like the more protein powders and whey stuff they sell, which is really inexpensive, especially coming from, these big lots and sad realities of factory farms, they make more money. So they promote that. And what happens? You see bodybuilders with kidney failure and, liver issues and dying early because they're one massively overdoing it in terms of just like pushing way too hard too much, but also because they're eating more calories than everyone else and more protein than everyone else and often more junk than everyone else.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. Um, so let's see. And then, you had already touched on, and I want to go back to this, is that some of the largest animals in nature
Yeah,
are plant-based raw food eaters.
yeah,
They don't have
yeah,
a stove, so they don't cook, and
yeah,
they're getting their protein and all their energy
mm,
from plants
yeah,
out in nature.
yeah.
Like elephant and the horse and the bison and the
Uh-huh.
giraffe and the rhino and all
Gorillas
these
and yeah, they're
long lives.
huge. The
Yeah.
strongest and longest lived, and the ones also that don't need to sleep as much. Like people want to be. I mean, I'm a Leo. I love lions, but like they sleep most of the day. And it takes a lot of energy to eat that meat. To digest it, right? And so they're chilling all day. But those that have longer wake cycles and less sleep and live longer lives, they're generally plant eating animals. And the carnivores only want to eat the plant-eating animals. They don't want to eat the meat-eating animals. They probably don't taste as good because they're conjecture there. But yeah, it just makes so much more sense to be following our actual natural design. Looking to physiology and anatomy, and we look at the bonobo, the pygmy chimpanzee, which is the closest genetically to us. And what is their diet made up? Fruits and vegetables. They eat the most fruit of any of the primates. So it's pretty cool. And when you follow that kind of logic, it just brings you to the logical conclusion, that fruits and vegetables make up the best staple in our diets.
Yeah. And I had always believed that the bonobo was eating primarily fruit,
Yeah,
but found out more recently that it was like 50% fruit, 50% leafy green. So
yeah,
that they were eating vegetable content.
lots,
Lots,
absolutely.
lots of it. Yeah.
Some added context there though that is really important because this is one of the first things when I got into nutrition that kind of confused me, and I still think it's confusing a lot of people, is most people talk in terms of volume or weight, right? And so when we're talking volume and weight, there's a big difference between eating 50-50 volume compared to 50-50 calories. And on an 80-10-10 approach or a fruit-based approach, we may be eating 80% of our calories from fruit, but when you measure it out in terms of volume, it can be really similar and closer to 50-50. And that would be similar with the bonobos, because in order for them to actually be getting 50-50, like 50% calories from fruit and 50% of their calories from vegetables, they'd be needing to eat, like, let's say 8 pounds of fruit and then like 30 or 25 pounds of vegetables, and they're not eating that every day. But volume wise, even a couple hundred calories of vegetables is really big because they are the lowest calorie density foods out there, and they have more fiber, so they're more digestion intensive, right? So I just wanted to bring that clarity because vegetables are super, super important. But if you try and get 50% of your calories from greens, you're going to be sitting there munching every like 20 heads of lettuce a day. It's a lot.
Yeah, you're just going to be eating that
Yeah, you're going to be
all day.
grazing all day.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great point. Great point.
And that
Yeah.
naturally boosts the protein a lot, of course. In consuming the greens, it boosts up the proteins, it boosts up the essential fatty acids as well in a really good ratio. It brings more dense alkaline mineralization, which, especially for people new to this lifestyle, that's really dang important. I think a lot of people get into this and think fruit, fruit, fruit is the easiest to digest and it's the perfect food. But they're not recognizing that one, it's lower in the alkaline minerals than greens. And then two, if they're coming from any other diet and they're holding some weight, well, they have a lot of acidity held up in their fat tissue that is going to be released as they lose weight. And if they don't have that extra alkalinity to buffer out those acids being eliminated and detoxified from, where's it going to come from? So it's not a picture you want. So I definitely recommend greens as an important part of a raw food diet, even possibly more so in the first few weeks, months, years of the lifestyle itself.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. Yeah. So those were my questions. I believe we went through all of my
Mhm.
questions. I'm just also looking at some of your other myths. Also were related. Let me just look at this. Here we go.
Wendy's
Uh,
asking a question. She's saying, I gained weight on 100% fruit when I first started. What do you think of that? There used to be a myth out there saying that you can't get overweight on fruit, like you can't overdo it, which I know 100% to be false. And, Wendy's sharing that exact um, same sentiment. And I know a friend, Andrew Perlot, he ran an experiment where he purposefully overate on fruit for a few months at a time and gained quite a bit of fat. And it is possible, but it is generally pretty hard. The two ways that people can do that is one, if they're really emotionally eating and just, completely ignoring satiation cues and eating past that point where you're like, I've had enough, where you're like, ew, like I gained weight on fruit because, and I gained about like 6 or 7 pounds, 8 pounds, more than felt good at all. And the reason there being was I injured myself.
Also emphasize like the dried fruit that
Yeah.
doesn't have as much water content. And I've seen people put on weight by eating a lot of dates and things like that.
Yeah,
So,
which usually is also coupled with that emotional eating, just
yeah,
snacking on dates, like
yeah.
in between meals, snacking on dates. But when we're talking about eating meals, it's fairly hard to do unless we're basically ignoring that natural satiation and we're emotionally eating, or if we're just under the idea that just sweet fruit is all we need. And like you said, like dried fruit and bananas, that's the only fruit you're eating, and you're eating it day in and day out without actually getting outside and getting that exercise and using your muscles and burning some of that as well. So it definitely can be done. If you overeat any calories, you're going to slowly gain weight.
Hmm.
But in my case, I remember I gained weight because I was used to eating a certain amount, and then I got injured, and I wasn't able to skateboard, and I didn't really pick it up with other activities. So I was basically just sedentary, but I didn't really think much, and I just ate the exact same volume. I got used to eating the exact amount of banana smoothie, and it's funny because I actually remember like during that time I'd be drinking the smoothie, and where I would normally be really happy to drink the 2 liter, and it felt perfect at that time I'd get to about a liter and a half and I'd start to actually feel like really sweeted out and just kind of be like, ugh, but I'd still force it down because I just thought like I don't want to waste it and I might as well just have it. But after like a month of doing that, I started putting on pounds and really noticing it. And then I luckily got back to skateboarding and then it came off anyway. But yeah, you can overdo it, but like I said in the beginning, it's harder to overdo than to underdo, especially if we're looking at it in the context of being mindful of emotional eating, chewing well, being present when we eat, and again, erring on the side of 1 or 2 bites more, but never forcing or never getting to that point where you're actually like, ugh, gross, like this is too much, like that's when it's really good to stop. And
Yeah.
accompanying those with vegetables, like increasing the greens in the diet and fruit, veggies, and all that stuff lowers the caloric density. And I mean, we only have a specific amount of space in our digestive tract per day. So if you're including more veggies and greens and fruit veggies and not just sweet fruit, but the whole gamut of, more water rich and some acid fruits and melons and all that good stuff, more often the case is people are eating not enough and start losing weight. So knowing both
Yeah.
sides of that can be
My
really helpful to find. Yeah.
definitely was my case. And I do see a lot of people doing that in transition when they do not realize this because
Yeah.
people are filling up a plate on a mainstream diet,
Yeah.
which puts on weight
Yeah.
often. You have a piece of
Yeah.
meat and a vegetable, and like it's already way too many calories and
Yeah.
protein, and you're putting on weight. And then you transition. If you try to just fill up a small amount of space with food, you can very quickly lose weight, which was what happened to me. And I
Yeah.
learned really
Yeah.
fast that,
It's so common.
yeah,
It's absolutely super common.
definitely, definitely. So those were my questions for you about protein.
Hmm.
There's so many great myths that you have here that are really, really true.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go into another myth here, but I just wanted to touch on like the whole hybridization, which,
Mhm.
becomes like a big
Yeah.
topic with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like if something has seeds or it doesn't have seeds.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of protein,
Mhm.
if we're eating a plant that has been so-called hybridized, where the seeds have been removed and it's been called, tampered by man,
Mhm.
is there a difference in the nutrition, in the protein of
Yeah.
food and what we're really getting from it? Many people ask, like, should I not eat seedless watermelon or
Yeah.
seedless grapes?
Yeah.
I know this is another myth, but it is a little
Yeah.
bit.
Well, I definitely go deeper in there than I will here, but the short story of what I'll say about it is the nutritional difference is negligible in most cases and not always higher or lower in one or the other. It depends upon the cultivar and the fruit itself. But in a lot of cases, when people are thinking about the higher protein, or even in some cases, the higher mineral levels that are said to be in seeded fruits, like you can go on Chronometer and check, the difference between, it's often the nutrients in the seed, which I don't know about you. I don't know almost anybody who eats, say, seedless grapes or seeded grapes and chews up every single seed or eats watermelon. I know some people that like the watermelon seeds, but to me, this is actually missing the point. It's like those seeds are designed to pass through you and further the plant. They're not really designed for our consumption, and they do have some inhibitors in them, and they're usually bitter and not that tasty. And it doesn't matter what diet we're looking at, whether we're looking at a vegan diet, especially when we're talking kind of healthy kind of approaches. There are going to be people that convince themselves that something they don't like is good because they heard it's good for them. And truthfully, when people are talking about crunching up, seeds from most fruits, I think that kind of falls into that category. At least for myself, it's been very rare that I've crunched up a seed in a fruit and actually been like, yum, this is good. Like that adds to the enjoyment. Usually it takes away from the texture, it brings a bitter flavor. And again, I think people are just tricking themselves. And hey, you know what? Maybe some people, they just love it. And watermelon seeds are one of the few exceptions. I've crunched up a lot of seeds from a different bunch of different foods. But when we're talking about the edible portion, like the juicy, sweet part that Mother Nature really uses to entice us to spread the seeds, the difference in terms of nutrients is really negligible and is going to come much more down to the growing practices or again the cultivar itself. So that's not really an issue. And I mean, in terms of hybridization, people have this idea that hybrids are some GMO
Yeah.
frankenfood and that, like they're the devil's food. And they don't realize that, I mean, seedless grapes have been around for thousands of years, like literally over 2,000 years, and bananas longer than that, around 3,000, if I'm correct in my reference. And, plants go seedless in nature through, either not being fertilized or through other natural means, and we just watched that process and learnt about it and were able to reproduce it because people enjoy seedless foods. It's easier to consume. And I by no means am taking the stance that seeded food is bad in any way, shape, or form, but the demonization and the fear around things like seeded grapes and seeded watermelon is completely unfounded. Um, there is no information besides like fear tactic kind of mythological viewpoints, philosophical viewpoints that really have any validity, and again, it kind of comes back to like living in philosophy land versus living in reality with good backed information, so I mean, besides that too, like essentially if you go far back enough, every single thing we eat is a hybrid, like even heirlooms technically are hybrids, like in a shorter term sense, there are some that are have been the same for a longer period of time, but they still all, when you really go back to the evolutionary history, are hybrids of other plants mixing and genetic mutations and all that kind of stuff. And I really look at it in a different way. I think it's amazing and beautiful, and I feel so blessed that we have grown synergistically over time with fruit and intelligently crossbred different fruits to bring about desired traits. Because I really think that people over glamorize the past. We got a snoo.
Aww. Aww.
He just came, but I think people
I've
over
seen your
glamour.
kitty. It reminds me of the cat that I grew up with, Scamper.
Oh,
We had
Scamper.
20 years. Yeah.
Oh, what a little scamp.
Yeah.
Snoo is such a good
Look
girl.
just
She's
Scamper.
But I think people over glamorize the past, thinking like, oh, like in the past, we just lived in these lush jungles with perfectly ripe durians and papayas all over the place. And, we're just like, that's what we got to get back to. It's like, no, we're opportunistic, often, eating non-ideal foods, secondary, third choices, bark and grubbing for anything we could. And, eating underripe, really fiber-rich fruits and things that were higher fiber and lower nutrient content, or sorry, higher fiber but lower calorie content, and that caused them to basically need to scavenge all day, to be out scavenging. I feel so dang blessed that we can actually have the cream of the crop, the foods that they would be picking given the option every single time. Bonobos have been shown if they're given enough fruit, they'll just eat fruit. Like they'll that's their main thing that they want to eat, right?
Mhm.
So like I don't really want to be scavenging all day with bigger jaw muscles because they needed to be breaking through more cellulose and all that stuff. I don't see that as an advantage. That's surviving, But I think we now truly have the opportunity to thrive, even with, like the realities of the fruit kind of market and shipping and all that stuff today. We're so blessed. We're back in the garden and the foods we have are way better than any other choice we have besides growing our own or, going to the farmer's market and stuff like that. Like, yeah, we can increase the quality with our choices, but at the same time, I don't see anything compared to what we see in the general grocery store as a better option, So it's kind of to me a bit of a non sequitur to be afraid of these foods and limit your choices to just a few varieties around. Because I've seen the same thing. Like I've seen people like, oh my God, I'd never eat it. Like I'd never have a seedless watermelon. They're just garbage. And
Yeah.
and again, it's one of those
Some
things that I
people have
think is kind of
said that to me as
yeah.
well, and I'm always surprised when somebody says that about any fruit. I mean, when you see what people are eating in terms of ultra processed food, and then
Yeah.
they're saying that about a hybridized fruit, it's kind of crazy.
It is. It really is. And it's really, to me, uh, it's sad. And I think it's a disservice personally to the movement because it limits choices. It makes people afraid. It makes them less likely to be able to afford to get enough. And it's always better to get enough rather than to get way less variety or less volume, less than you need, because less isn't more when it's in terms of getting enough nutrients and getting enough calories, which goes hand in hand. And I do want to briefly, because that kind of brings me back actually to the protein myth. So often people think if they're like if they want to build muscle, that they need to eat more protein. And hey, like we talked about before with adding, say, sprouted lentils or hemp seeds and stuff like that, or spirulina if you really like that, or mushrooms or broccoli, any of these things, like there are ways to boost up your protein if you need, right? If you want to. But in reality, the way that nature does it, like you don't see animals that are like more athletic finding the high protein food. They eat more food. If you're working out and you're challenging yourself, you're expending energy, and then when you eat more total food, everything goes up, not just protein, but all the symphony of nutrition included. So you get more energy for it, you get more water, you get more minerals, you get more protein, you get more fats, and it doesn't come from necessarily being like specific honing in on protein. I think we kind of missed the mark, and it kind of goes back to that food combining, protein pairing slash um, what is it called? Where you must have every single food group represented on your plate. Where we like to put things in boxes and be like, that's protein, that's carb, that's fat, and it's like that's a flawed concept in and of itself. It's just we just need more foods that we're biologically adapted to,
Yeah.
and to
And a
get
lot of
enough
times
volume.
each of these foods has some of everything.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, all the whole foods have all the essential
Yeah.
amino acids in them, right? So,
I mean,
it
even
just takes
something
variety.
like lettuce has a little bit of fat,
Oh yeah,
even
yeah.
so
You eat butter lettuce. It's called butter lettuce because it is higher in fats and it's more creamy. You kind of notice that. And I mean, obviously, if you're coming from a standard American diet and just jumping into this, you won't notice those subtle flavors and textures quite as much. But the longer you go with eating, a fruit and vegetable based diet and not overstimulating your taste buds, those flavors and those textures just start to pop, and become much more prevalent.
yeah. Wow, fantastic. What great information on protein. I hope a lot of people watch this video
Yeah, me too.
because it's not talked about enough, and so many people are still thinking, they're still watching all of the marketing commercials that that you're going to get more protein eating animal food,
Yeah,
when all these wonderful whole plants, especially raw,
yeah,
you're getting so much more nutrition, you're getting adequate, sometimes even too much protein.
absolutely.
So these are
Absolutely.
to look at and realize, like, we can get enough and we can be a lot healthier.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would contend not only can we get enough, but it's predictable if we're eating a varied raw diet with enough calories, and if we want to experiment and add some different foods that are higher protein, that's great. I mean, there's a lot of room for variety and for tastes and for preferences, but it's not something I'd put fear into, or it's not something I'd be worrying about. Most people are getting too much. And like you said, the cases of protein deficiency are actually quite low, like it usually is happening in, you know, situations where people are caretaking and not really feeding someone adequately, just, giving them like one or two types of foods, or in places where people are starving, but in the first world and with the reality of a whole foods based diet, to me, it's just something that isn't really worth concern.
A non-issue.
Yeah, it's really a non-issue, especially with all the stuff we've talked about here. And,
Yeah.
like, I don't see any reason to need to add cooked foods or to like overly focus on protein foods and think about protein all the time. Like I like to add some sprouts sometimes, and I like hemp seeds, and I like mushrooms, and I love greens, and I eat them because I love them. That's the first reason whatsoever, and I've been in different cycles where I consumed much less of those, and I still did amazingly well. Again, it comes back to having that sense of abundance, enjoying variety, and yeah, just over the long term, looking at it in that perspective. I'm sorry, Snoo is starting to distract me here. She was nibbling my arm.
Great. What great information for everybody. Thank you so much, Chris.
Such a
This was
pleasure.
really wonderful. And yeah, do you have anything else you want to add about protein and the whole protein myth, and why somebody doesn't need to be obsessed with like eating animal food all day long?
Yeah. Well, I mean, beyond it just being unnecessary, like the way I look at it is I understand in times past where there wasn't worldwide shipping, we didn't have refrigeration, we didn't have the knowledge that we have now. These were foods that were culturally available and looked at as ways to stay alive. You know, they meant survival. You know, they're survival foods, and is the way I kind of look at it. But again, we're back in the garden. You know, we have worldwide shipping, we have year-round availability of the most nutritious foods on the planet that just come with benefits, you know, and that's something that's been ringing true in my head, you know, a lot lately is, you know, you look at animal products and yeah, like you can make that choice, but they come with negatives, you know, they come with side effects, you know. And when you look at fruits and vegetables, they just come with benefits. I would much rather be focusing on the foods that don't come with side effects, just bring benefits and lead me to feeling better, lighter, stronger, recovering faster. I mean, I didn't even mention that. That's the main reason I got into raw food was to recover faster so I could perform better athletically. And I wouldn't be doing it 21 years later if it didn't offer me an advantage, the raw advantage, right? So it all kind of comes into play, you know. So there's
Yeah,
no need to be, you know, taking the life of other living beings. There's no need to be chomping on super high protein foods all the time and be protein obsessed. You know, it just takes looking back at Mother Nature and how it was designed, and you know, if we're eating the foods we're physiologically adapted for, whole foods containing all the amino acids we require, it again becomes really a non-issue.
that's right. That's right. And so all these people out there thinking that they need to build muscle and have meat for bodybuilding and all that, it's just not necessary. And
No, and
we
I
can
will,
see that people who are living this whole plant foods lifestyle, and especially based on raw vegan foods. And
yeah,
that also brings me just to ending here to just bring up the ultimate raw vegan bundle,
yeah,
which we really got into this protein thing, and so it was kind of hard to focus on the bundle. But we really do want to tell everybody that this ultimate raw vegan bundle is impressive.
yeah, it's
And it's
awesome.
like for only $50, you're going to be getting like over $1,000 worth of information, including Chris's book on
Yeah,
all of these health myths that are out there, including the one we talked about today on
yeah,
protein. There's so many others in
yeah.
there that are
That's
worth like I would have also wanted to talk with you about the enzyme one. That's a good
yeah,
one.
that's a big one.
So
Yeah,
many.
yeah,
The mucoid plaque. So just even Chris's book is
yeah.
worth the price of the bundle. I have my book in there with one of
Just
my
awesome too.
Feather Smith. We've done some really nutritious, delicious, very uncomplicated raw vegan recipes
Awesome.
to get you feeling good, to get you feeling like thriving on this lifestyle.
Mhm.
And I have a whole chart that I made on why some people don't succeed on a raw vegan diet.
Yeah,
And I think some of what we talked about today is also in that chart.
yeah, yeah. No, it's
So
so important. It's so important, and there is only a few days left of this too, so it's a great chance to check it all out and you know see if it fits. I'd be surprised if it doesn't because it's a really amazing collection, you know, from so many people putting their hearts out there and their experience and their knowledge and their passion. So it's a great opportunity to check it out. If I could, I'd love to really briefly answer these two quick
go ahead.
questions here. I see James asked about the molecules of animal protein, plant and protein the same. When you break it down to the amino acids, yes. But the animals come with other components, you know, like the heme iron and other things that aren't really great for us. So, you know, we can get the same amino acids, but just you know, cutting out the middleman so we don't actually have to break those bonds between the linked amino acids. They come more in the free amino acid form. So it's yeah, it is the same essentially, but it's easier on the system and again without those negatives associated with it. He's new. And then the other one was your thoughts on eating insects. I mean, if you want to go ahead, I'm not drawn to it whatsoever. Bonobos do eat insects, and we accidentally do eat insects when we're sleeping and you know in food and stuff like that. Um, but it's not something that I see as a necessity. You know, again, you know, animals are opportunistic and they eat whatever they can, and they're more focused on surviving. You know, and people again think that the jungles are just, like lush with readily available ripe fruit all over the place at all times. It's not really the case. If you've ever been in the jungle, it's not really like that. So they're eating whatever they can, whereas now we have our first tier choice foods, like high quality and really easily edible, available all year round, all the time. So I don't see a reason to go to second tier foods when we have our first tier foods so available.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. And so for those of you who want to get this bundle, there's courses, there are many, many, many recipe books, there are how-to books, books all learning all about how to do raw food correctly, the low-fat, raw vegan way.
Mhm.
And that's one reason why I love this bundle,
Mhm.
because it is a low fat, raw vegan bundle that really does promote health. You can
Mhm.
get everything you need for just $50 by signing up for this bundle.
Yeah.
And you can go to my profile and click my link. It's Super Healthy Raw, or Chris's at the Raw Advantage.
Mhm.
And you will be blown away by the impressive work, the recipes, all of the wonderful information you'll get. There's even, I think, a yoga class in there. There's many things. It's not just food, but you'll love all these great easy recipes. There's a Chinese takeout,
Yeah.
which if you want to have people over and do something really fun,
Yeah.
there's so much in there where you can be really creative and fun and really share with others who don't think that raw food is interesting. You can really change their mind very quickly.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Couldn't agree enough.
yeah. So thank you so much, Chris. It was great talking with you again today.
Such a pleasure.
Love this talk. Love coming up with these different topics to talk about and to get deep with. And I think anybody who is here or watches this video is going to learn a lot.
Mhm.
And
Hope
I look
so.
forward to seeing you next time. And thank you, everybody who attended.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much, Karen. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Have an
Bye.
awesome rest of
Bye,
your day.
everybody.
See everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.